She fired the single dad for wasting time on a scrap engine. It later powered the fastest car on Earth. 83 engineers worked on the Veyron, class speed record attempt. 83 of them, in matching branded jackets, standing in a facility that had cost $41 million to build and smelled of titanium dust and money. Then the door at the far end of the hangar opened, and Levi Holt walked in with a cardboard box under one arm and a 4-year-old girl on his hip, her small hand gripping the collar of his shirt, a stuffed rabbit hanging from her fist by one ear. His name was already on the termination paperwork. They had printed it that morning. And the engine sitting on its test stand in the rear corner of the facility. The one that looked like junk. The one that had been written off. The one that HR had cited in his dismissal as evidence of time wasted on company hours. That engine, in 11 months, would power the fastest production car ever recorded on a closed circuit. None of those 83 engineers built it. Levi Holt built it, alone, on weekends, with a daughter on a stool beside him and a rabbit named Cog on the workbench keeping watch. Press play on this one. It earns every minute. The Stratos Dynamics facility sat on 40 acres of industrial land outside Reno, Nevada, the kind of terrain that looks like the Earth gave up halfway through deciding what to do with itself. Flat, pale, enormously indifferent. The building itself was a monument to the belief that if you spent enough on the exterior, the interior would naturally follow. 60 feet of composite cladding. An atrium with reception staff who wore the same color as the walls. A test facility in the rear that had been featured in 2 automotive publications and 1 architecture magazine, which told you something about where the priorities lived. Levi Holt had worked there for 3 years. His title was Propulsion Systems Analyst, which was a title that described about a third of what he actually did and none of what he was actually capable of. He had a small office near the rear of the engineering wing. 2 whiteboards that were always full, and a reputation among the other engineers that was difficult to characterize, precisely because it occupied a category that organizations like Stratos Dynamics didn't have a form for. He was not the loudest person in any room. He was not the most credentialed. He had a state university degree and no postgraduate work and calloused hands from the kind of work he did outside the facility, on his own time, with his own tools, in a garage that was rented and slightly too cold in winter. What he had, the other engineers knew he had, even the ones who didn't like him for having it, was the ability to hear what an engine was doing wrong before the instruments registered it. Not metaphorically, literally. He could stand next to a running motor and identify a harmonic anomaly by sound before the vibration analysis software picked it up. He could read a dyno chart the way other people read sentences, with comprehension that was immediate and total, and didn't require him to refer back to the beginning. He had come to the facility 3 years ago because the facility had posted a job, and he had needed income. And there were not many facilities that paid the kind of money Stratos paid. And he had a daughter to raise, and a mortgage on a house that he was managing by himself, and a grief that he carried in the particular way of people who have decided to continue functioning despite what they are carrying. His wife had been dead for 2 years when he started the job. Her name had been Ruth. She had died quietly, not suddenly, which was in some ways harder. The kind of illness that gave you time to prepare, and that no amount of preparation was actually preparation for. She had been 31. Ellie had been 2. Levi had been 32 and had become, in the span of 4 months, the kind of person who made pancakes on Saturday mornings and packed lunches on weekday evenings, and cried in the car sometimes on the way to drop off where no one could see, and was otherwise functional. Ellie was 4 now. She had Ruth's eyes and Levi's stubbornness, which was a combination that he found both exhausting and correct. She had a stuffed rabbit she called Cog, named She had explained with great seriousness at age 3, because Cog was a working rabbit, an important rabbit, a rabbit who had a job to do. And Cog went everywhere Ellie went, which meant Cog had attended 3 daycare orientations, 1 engineering open house, and more Saturday mornings in Levi's garage than most adults managed in a year. The engine in the rear corner of Facility B was not a company project. That was the thing. That was the thing that had been used against him, that had been placed in the termination paperwork, that had been cited as evidence of misuse of company resources. It was not a company project. It was his project. He had brought it in, the block, the heads, the raw castings, the notebooks full of calculations that dated back 18 months. On a Saturday, with approval from the facility's supervisor, using bench space he had cleared himself, on his own hours, with his own materials. The facility's supervisor had retired 4 months ago. His successor had not been told about the arrangement. The termination paperwork did not mention the approval. The termination paperwork had been written by a man named Donovan Reed, who was 47 and had been at Stratos Dynamics for 9 years, and who had watched Levi Holt outperform his own team's output for 3 years without credit, and had decided, when the opportunity presented itself, to present it as something else entirely. The opportunity had presented itself in the form of a new CEO. Her name was Cassandra Wen. She had been appointed 6 weeks ago, following the departure of the previous CEO under circumstances that were described in the press release as a planned transition, and that were described by everyone inside the building as anything but. She was 34. She had a reputation for restructuring efficiency, for identifying waste, for moving quickly. She had spent her first 6 weeks at Stratos, receiving briefings from department heads, and the briefings she had received from Donovan Reed about the propulsion engineering team were thorough and specific, and contained exactly the information Reed had chosen to share and none of the information he had chosen not to. In those briefings, Levi Holt appeared once. Under the heading of Resource Allocation Concerns, the notation read, Junior Analyst, Unclear Deliverables, Non-Project Use of Facility Space. The engine in the corner was described as personal hobby equipment stored in active workspace. It was not hobby equipment. It was not personal in the sense Reed meant. It was the product of 18 months of calculation and testing and failure and correction and the specific kind of obsession that only looks like a hobby to people who have never been obsessed with anything that mattered. Cassandra Wen had signed the termination form on a Tuesday morning. She had signed 11 others. She had not spoken to Levi before signing. That was not unusual. That was the efficiency. By 9 o'clock that morning, Levi had been called to HR. By 9:30, he had his box. By 9:45, he was walking back through the engineering wing with the box under his arm and Ellie on his hip. She had been with him that morning because daycare was closed for a facilities issue, and there had been no one else available, and he had brought her in with him because he'd had a desk and a daughter and no third option. And he was walking toward the exit when Cassandra Wen came around the corner from the executive wing. She stopped. She looked at him. She looked at Ellie, who was looking at her with the direct, unsettling assessment of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned that eye contact can be uncomfortable. Cog hung from Ellie's fist, the rabbit's legs dangling, the embroidered eyes facing forward. Cassandra said, "Mr. Holt." He said yes. She said, "I want you to know that the decision this morning was based on a comprehensive review." "It wasn't personal," he said. "I understand." He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not tell her about the 18 months, or the engine in the corner, or the approval he had received from a supervisor who had since retired. He said he understood, and he continued walking. Ellie, from her position on his hip, looked back at Cassandra over his shoulder. She held Cog up slightly, the way she did when she was uncertain about something. The rabbit's embroidered eyes regarded the new CEO of Stratos Dynamics with the same total neutrality they applied to everything. Cassandra watched him go. She would think about that moment for a long time afterward. The garage behind Levi's rented house was slightly too cold in winter and slightly too hot in summer, and lit by 4 fluorescent fixtures, one of which buzzed at a frequency that was technically below the threshold of annoyance, but had a way of accumulating over long periods. The floor was clean. The workbench was organized with the kind of organization that was not decorative but functional. Every tool in a position relative to every other tool that reflected the order of how they were used. The engine came home in the back of his truck on a Wednesday. It was too heavy for one person to move properly, but he moved it anyway. The way you move things when there is no one else to help, and the thing needs to be moved. Ellie watched from the garage door in her yellow coat, with Cog tucked under her arm, monitoring the process with the attentiveness she brought to things she considered important. When it was on the stand, she said, "Is it hurt?" He said, "A little, but we can fix it." She said, "Like you fix everything." He said, "We'll see." She climbed onto her stool, the small wooden one with the green seat that lived in the corner, and placed Cog on the workbench, where the rabbit could see, and she said, "Cog wants to watch." He said, "Good." Cog's been watching since the beginning. He had started this engine 14 months before the termination, which meant he had started it a year into working at Stratos, which meant he had been carrying the idea of it even longer than that. Since before the job, since before the facility with the $41 million build cost. Since before Stratos Dynamics had any claim on his time or his mind, or the hours between 11 at night and 2 in the morning when Ellie was asleep, and the garage was quiet, and the fluorescent that buzzed at a frequency below the threshold of annoyance was the loudest thing in the world. The engine was a turbocharged flat-plane V8, but the architecture was not standard in the ways that mattered. The firing order was his. The crank geometry was his. The induction system, a variable geometry design that shifted the intake path length based on throttle position and RPM, was entirely, exclusively, provably his, documented in notebooks that were dated and witnessed, in a design that had no precedent in any production or prototype engine he had studied, because it was not derived from anything he had studied up. It had come from the specific intersection of his understanding of fluid dynamics, his 3 years of listening to engines tell him things instruments didn't pick up, and the 18 months of garage hours he had paid for with his own sleep. The numbers on paper were not credible. That was what he had understood going in, and had continued understanding throughout. The numbers were not credible, because the numbers assumed that the variable induction system could maintain flow characteristics through the transition phase at a rate that no existing system had achieved without parasitic losses that erased the theoretical gain. He had spent 4 months on that transition phase alone. 4 months of evenings and weekends, of calculations revised and physical tests on component rigs, of Ellie asleep upstairs and Cog on the bench and the buzzing fluorescent and the pencil moving across paper until the calculation aligned with what he could hear in his head when he imagined the airflow. It aligned, eventually. The way things align when you have been patient enough and honest enough to keep correcting, until the theory and the reality are the same thing. He had been running initial tests in the corner of Facility B when the termination came. The bench results had been preliminary. They had not been shared with anyone at Stratos, because they were not Stratos's results. They were his results, preliminary, belonging to him, to be shared when he chose to share them with whoever he chose to share them with. What Donovan Reed had seen, when he looked at that engine in the corner, was not the results. He had not seen the notebooks. He had not seen the transition phase calculations. He had seen a block of metal in a corner that was not assigned to any company program. In a workspace he wanted cleared. In a facility whose resources he had been arguing should be reallocated to his team's projects. And he had described it accordingly to a new CEO who did not yet know what she didn't know. The man who knew was an older engineer named Theodore Briggs. He went by Teddy. He was 63, thickly built, had worked in motorsport propulsion for 31 years before joining Stratos, and had an opinion about every engine he'd ever encountered that he delivered in the same flat, empirical voice regardless of whose feelings were at stake. He had come by Levi's bench twice while the engine was in the facility, and had stood there looking at it without speaking for lengths of time that were, by normal social standards, unusual. He had asked 2 questions, both technical, both answered by Levi, in a way that had made Teddy look at the engine, and then look at Levi, and then look at the engine again. He had not told anyone about this. Levi had not asked him to. And Teddy Briggs was not a man who volunteered things he hadn't been asked about. He called Levi 3 days after the termination. He said, "You still working on it?" Levi said yes. Teddy said, "Good." He hung up. That was the entirety of the conversation. There was also a woman named Ada Reyes, who had been Stratos Dynamics' chief performance analyst for 2 years, and who, on the day Levi was terminated, had looked at his empty desk and said nothing aloud, and had taken a walk around the facility's perimeter at lunchtime that lasted 40 minutes, and had come back with an expression that her colleagues recognized as the one she wore when something had gone wrong that hadn't been announced yet. Ada had seen the preliminary bench numbers, not because Levi had shown them to her, because she was a performance analyst with a very specific skill set, and she had been in Facility B on a different matter, and she had seen a printout face up on his bench, and she had read it in the 3 seconds it took her to walk past, and she had kept walking and had not said anything to anyone for 4 days, during which time she had run the implications 3 times in her head and arrived at the same place each time, which was a place that made her very careful about who she said anything to. She had said something to Teddy Briggs. Teddy had said, "I know." Ada had said, "Does anyone else?" Teddy had said, "Not yet." 11 months. That was how long it took. 11 months of evenings and weekends, of Ellie on the green stool with Cog on the bench, of the buzzing fluorescent and the calculations and the physical tests on the rig in the corner, of the transition phase performance, coming in at numbers that Levi checked 3 times each, because the discipline of not trusting extraordinary results until they had been verified multiple times was one he had built into himself so thoroughly it was no longer a discipline but a reflex. He did not tell people what he was doing. He took a contract position with a small fabrication firm that paid the bills and asked less of him, cognitively, than his work did, which left the cognitive capacity available for the garage. He made lunches and did drop-offs, and picked up Ellie from daycare, and made dinner on the evenings he could manage it properly. And on the evenings, he couldn't. He made eggs and they ate at the table anyway, with Cog propped against the condiment holder, and then Ellie went to bed, and he went to the garage and he worked. At 9 months, the engine ran. Not fully, not on the variable induction system, but the base configuration ran cleanly, and the sound of it in the garage at 11 on a Thursday night was the sound of something that had been waiting to exist for a long time finally existing. Ellie was asleep. He sat on the floor with his back against the workbench and his hands resting on his knees, and he listened to it run for 4 minutes, and then he shut it down. He did not celebrate. He made a note in the notebook. He went to bed. At 11 months, he had the full system running. He had numbers. He had documentation. He had notebooks going back 18 months. Each page dated, each significant calculation signed and dated at the moment of completion, each test result logged with a timestamp. He had, in the most literal and specific sense, a proof. He called Teddy Briggs at 7 in the morning on a Saturday. Teddy said, "You're done." Levi said, "Come see it." Teddy came that afternoon. He stood in the garage for 40 minutes. He looked at the engine. He looked at the notebooks. He did not say anything for long stretches. When he finally spoke, he said, "These transition numbers. You've run this configuration 12 times?" Levi said, 14. Teddy said, "Same result each time." Levi said, "Within the variance I'd expect from the measurement equipment." Teddy looked at the engine one more time. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his hands. He said, "Levy, you understand what this is?" Levi said, "Yes." Teddy said, "Does anyone else?" Levi said, "I'd saw the early numbers." Before I was terminated, Teddy said, "She told me." A pause. Teddy said, "There's a speed record attempt scheduled. 6 months out, the drive system is built. The aero is built. The propulsion is the problem. They haven't found a solution that meets the power-to-weight requirement without the thermal management issues. I know the program director. His name is Werner Bowman. I've worked with him for 20 years. He stopped. I can make a call. I'm not making any promises about what happens after that. But I can make the call." Levi said, "Make the call." Teddy made the call. Werner Bowman came to the garage on a Tuesday. He was 61, lean, with the focused, unhurried quality of someone who has spent a career evaluating things and has long since stopped performing the evaluation for anyone else's benefit. He spent 2 hours in the garage. He asked questions. He read sections of the notebooks. He ran the engine twice and stood with his arms folded and listened to it the way people listen to something they have been trying to find. Afterward, he sat at the workbench with a coffee and said, "The thermal management on the transition phase. You've solved it at what threshold?" Levi said. "Sustained full load above 1200 degrees without degradation. I have 60 minutes of logged test data at that condition." Werner said, "And the power figure?" Levi said the number. Werner was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's 40 horsepower above what we've modeled as achievable for this class." Levi said, "I know." Werner said, "How?" Levi said, "The induction path geometry changes the effective compression behavior above 7,000 RPM. It's not recoverable by standard means. It's structural." Werner looked at him, not assessing, past that. The look of a man who has found the thing he came looking for and is now thinking about what comes next. He said, "What do you want?" Levi said, "Credit. My name on the documentation, a fair licensing arrangement." He paused. "And I want it on record that the engine was built independently, outside Stratos, on my own time and resources." Werner said, "That last part won't be a problem to document. The first 3 I can make happen." He stood. He offered his hand. "I'll have a contract drawn by Thursday." The record attempt was 8 months later. Levi was present, not in the pit, not in the broadcast, but in a support truck 200 meters from the timing line with Ellie, in a folding chair beside him, and Cog on the armrest between them and Teddy. Briggs standing outside the truck with a coffee and a stopwatch he didn't technically need. When the car came through, Ellie stood up on her chair to see it. The sound reached them half a second after the car, which was correct physics, and also felt like something else. The way sounds do when they arrive from things that have been waiting to make them. The number came over the radio 6 minutes later. Teddy looked at his stopwatch. He looked at the truck. He opened the door and looked at Levi and said, "Record, 1 word," the way he said most things. Levi nodded. Ellie said, "Did it go fast?" He said, "Very fast." She said, "Faster than anything?" He said, "Faster than anything that's been timed." She thought about this. She picked up Cog from the armrest and held the rabbit in her lap and looked out the truck window at the track, which was now empty and large and very quiet after the thing that had happened on it. She said, "Cog knew it would work." He said, "Did Cog say that?" She said, "Cog doesn't say things. Cog just knows them." He looked at the rabbit, who was looking at the empty track with the same embroidered neutrality Cog brought to everything. He said, "That's fair." Teddy closed the truck door. He walked back to his spot 2 meters away and picked up his coffee and didn't say anything else, which was how Teddy expressed most things he felt strongly about. The story came out over the following weeks, the way stories come out when there is documentation. And there are people who know what the documentation means. And the documentation is not the kind that can be reinterpreted. Werner Bowman's team filed it in the program record. Teddy gave a brief statement to the publication that covered the record attempt. Ada Reyes, who was still at Stratos Dynamics, wrote a technical summary for an internal review that became external when the record made the kind of news that causes reviews to become external. The summaries describe the propulsion system's core innovation as originating from independent work conducted by a former Stratos analyst outside the facility on non-company time, predating and independent of any Stratos program, developed without company resources. Donovan Reed had been at Stratos for 9 years. He was no longer at Stratos. The departure had preceded the publication of Ada's summary by 3 weeks, announced internally as a restructuring of the propulsion department leadership, which was the kind of language that meant something more specific than it said. Cassandra Wen read the technical summary on a Friday morning. She read it twice. She put it face down on her desk and sat with it for a while. Then she picked up her phone and called the number she had requested from HR that morning, which was Levi Holt's number, which was not in her contacts but was in the employment record under terminated employees. He answered on the third ring. She said, "This is Cassandra Wen." He said, "I know." She said, "I've read the summary." He said, "I know." A pause, not a comfortable one, not an uncomfortable one, simply a real one, she said. "I signed a termination without speaking to you. I signed it based on a characterization of your work that was incomplete and, I now understand, deliberately constructed to be incomplete." She said this clearly, without qualification, and without the language people use when they are apologizing in the direction of an apology, without quite arriving at it. "I was wrong to do that. The decision caused you significant harm. That's on me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I appreciate you saying it that way." She said, "I'd like to meet. Not to offer you a position. I understand if that's not something you'd consider. I want to meet because there are things I want to understand better about how I was given information in my first weeks and what I should have done differently, and you are one of the few people who can tell me accurately." A pause. "I'd like to learn from it," he said. "I can do that." She said, "Next week?" He said, "Tuesday works." After he hung up, he sat in the garage for a few minutes with the phone in his hand. The engine was on its stand. Not the record engine. That was with Werner's team now, documented and assigned and properly credited. This was another project, early stage. A different idea he'd started turning over in his mind in the months since the record. The notebooks for it were new, the pages mostly blank, the calculations still at the stage where they lived more in his head than on paper. Ellie was at daycare. Cog was on the bench. He had left the rabbit there this morning because Ellie had been in a hurry and had only noticed the absence halfway down the front path and had turned back, solemnly, and returned Cog to the workbench and said, "So Cog can watch it while we're gone." He had said, "Good thinking." He put the phone down. He picked up the pencil. He opened the new notebook to the first real page, the one after the blank one at the front, and he looked at what he had written there 2 weeks ago. A set of initial conditions, a set of constraints, the beginning of a shape. And he added a line, then another. Outside, the Nevada light came through the garage window at the angle it came through in October, lower and longer than summer, reaching farther across the floor. It reached Cog's position on the bench and lit the rabbit's embroidered eyes for a moment. And then the light shifted as a cloud moved somewhere above the indifferent flat terrain. and the garage was the color it was most of the time. He kept writing. The pencil moved. The engine waited. The next idea was already taking the shape of something real. The meeting happened the following Tuesday at a coffee place, 3 blocks from the fabrication firm where Levi had been working contract hours. He had suggested it because the fabrication firm was where he had to be afterward, and because neutral ground suited him better than an office, and because he had made decisions about where he met people based on what felt honest since a time when he had stopped making decisions about honesty based on what was convenient. Cassandra arrived first. He saw her through the window as he walked up. She was at a corner table with a coffee, already, reading something on her phone, dressed with the same precision she had worn in the Stratos hallway on the morning he walked out of it. She looked up when he came in, and she did not smile in the practiced way he had seen in the facility. She simply looked at him. That was different. He got coffee, he sat down. She said, "I want to understand the timeline. Start from before I arrived." He did. He told her about the approval from the facility's supervisor. He told her about the 18 months before that, the evenings, the notebooks, the calculation on the transition phase. He told her what the engine was and what it wasn't, and how it had ended up in the corner of Facility B. He told her this without editorializing, without attribution, without the particular sourness that would have been understandable. He told it the way he told most things, which was the way he had experienced it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "The supervisor's approval. Was it in writing?" He said, "Email." "I have it," she said, "and the notebooks. Dated and witnessed." He said, "Dated. Not all witnessed. The ones from the last 8 months have timestamps on the digital backups." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Donovan Reed told me the engine was personal equipment brought in without authorization." He said it twice, in 2 separate briefings. He was consistent. She looked at her coffee. "I didn't ask anyone else." He said, "No." She said, "I should have." He said, "You should have." Not pointed, not forgiving either, just accurate. She looked up. She said, "What I want to know, and this isn't a question that excuses anything. It's a question I'm asking because I want to understand the full shape of it. Why didn't you say anything when I came around the corner that morning? When I told you the decision wasn't personal, you knew then what the engine was." He thought about this for a moment. He thought about the cardboard box. He thought about Ellie on his hip and Cog dangling from her fist. He thought about having had, in that moment, a choice between explaining himself to a woman who had already signed the paper and not explaining himself, he said, because the explanation wasn't for that moment. The explanation was for the engine, and the engine was going to do the explaining eventually, regardless of whether I stood in a hallway and made it complicated. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That's a very expensive kind of Thompsons." He said it was. She picked up her coffee. She set it down without drinking. She said, "You should know that the board has discussed whether a formal acknowledgement from Stratos, separate from Werner's program documentation, is appropriate. I've recommended it. It hasn't been decided yet." He said, "That's up to you." She said, "What would it mean to you?" He said, "Not much at this point. The record exists. The notebooks exist. Werner's documentation exists. The people who need to know." "No," she said. "But." He said, "But Ellie is 4. In 15 years, she's going to be old enough to look things up. I'd like for what she finds to be accurate." Cassandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll make sure it's accurate." He picked up his coffee. He drank. He set it down. She said, "The work you're doing now. The new notebooks." He said, "You read Ada's summary carefully." She said, "Ada mentioned there was a next thing." He said, "There's always a next thing." She said, "Is it related to what you built?" He said, "Adjacent. Different class of problem." She said, "How long?" He thought about the blank pages in the notebook. He thought about the calculation that was still living mostly in his head, the one that he hadn't written down yet, because he wasn't ready to commit it to paper, because writing it down would make it something he had to be honest about whether it worked. And it was still too early for that kind of honesty. He said, "Don't know yet, a while." She nodded. She did not press. That was different too. They sat for a few minutes without talking. With the coffee shop, doing what coffee shops do in the middle of a Tuesday morning, which is exist with moderate occupation and a low level of ambient noise that makes it easy to think. Eventually, she said, "Thank you for coming." He said, "You said Tuesday. Tuesday works for me." He finished his coffee. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He said, "For what it's worth, and I'm not saying this for your benefit. I'm saying it because it's accurate. What you did when you called me, how you said what you said, that wasn't nothing." She looked at him. He said, "It takes something to say it that way." He put on the jacket and walked out. The door closed. The October light on the sidewalk was the same low angle it had been in the garage that morning, longer and more precise than summer, finding things it didn't reach for most of the year. He walked the 3 blocks to the fabrication firm. He had 4 hours of contract work, then pick up at daycare, then home. At home, Cog would be on the workbench where Ellie left the rabbit that morning. The notebook would be open to the page with the new calculation. The engine on the stand would sit in the early evening light, coming through the window, patient and dense, and waiting for whatever came next. He walked. The light went where it went. The street did what streets do. He had a daughter to pick up by 4 o'clock and a problem in his head that was starting to take the shape of something worth writing down. He kept walking. There was a detail he had not told Cassandra. Not because it was a secret, because it didn't belong in the conversation they were having, which was a professional conversation about professional things, and this detail was not professional in nature. On the night the engine first ran, 9 months into the build, Thursday night at 11, Ellie asleep upstairs. He had sat on the floor of the garage for 4 minutes listening to it run, and then he had shut it down, and in the silence after the shutdown he had thought about Ruth. He did this sometimes, not deliberately, not as a practice. It happened in particular kinds of silences. The kind that followed something that had worked after a long time of trying, or the kind just before something he was going to do that couldn't be undone. He would think about her, and he would be present in those thoughts for a specific amount of time. And then he would return from them to the room he was actually in. What he thought about that night was a Tuesday evening 8 years ago, in the apartment before the house, before Ellie, before all of it. He and Ruth had been making dinner. She was making dinner. He was nominally helping, which meant standing adjacent and talking. And he had been explaining something about combustion dynamics. A problem he was working on then, and she had listened with the specific quality of attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. And he had stopped mid-sentence and said, "You actually care about this." She had said, "I care that you care about it," which is different, but it amounts to the same thing. He had thought about that sentence in the months after she died. He had thought about it specifically on the evenings in the garage, when the work was not going well and the calculations were wrong for reasons he couldn't yet locate. It was not a comfort exactly, but it was a true thing, and true things were useful in ways that comfort sometimes wasn't. He thought about it that Thursday night on the floor of the garage. He thought about Ellie upstairs, with Cog tucked under her arm the way she slept, the rabbit's embroidered eyes facing the ceiling. He thought about the engine on its stand, which had just done what he had spent 18 months calculating that it could do. He thought about the specific sounds it had made while running, which were the sounds he had imagined in his head for so long that hearing them from An actual engine had been like hearing a song you'd composed in your mind, finally played by instruments. He sat with all of that for a while. Then he made a note in the notebook. Then he went to bed. When Ellie had gotten up the next morning, she had gone immediately to the garage, which she sometimes did. She had looked at the engine on the stand with Cog in her arms. She had said, "Did something happen?" He had been making coffee. He had said, "Why?" She had said, "It looks different." He had looked at the engine. It didn't look different. It was on the stand. It was the same engine. It occupied the same corner of the same garage with the same overhead light. But he had understood what she meant in the imprecise way you understand. Things children mean that are imprecise, but not wrong. He had said, "It ran last night." She had said, "Did it sound right?" He had said, "Better than right." She had held Cog up to look at the engine, as she sometimes did, as if offering the rabbit a better angle. Cog regarded the engine with the usual embroidered neutrality. Ellie had said, "Cog knew it would." He had said, "How does Cog know things?" She had said, in the patient voice of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should know it by now, "Cog listens." He had looked at the rabbit. He had looked at his daughter. He had picked up his coffee and walked back inside to make breakfast, because it was Friday, and Friday meant eggs, and some things you kept, because the keeping of them was the whole point.